President Trump is set to travel to Pennsylvania next week ahead of the state's special House election on March 13th. It's the 18th district. It's just south of Pittsburgh, and the president is expected to rally support for Republican Rick Saccone, a state legislature and Air Force veteran. Democrat Conor Lamb is running against him. He's a former prosecutor and Marine veteran. For more, I want to bring in politics reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Potter. He joins me now from Pittsburgh. Chris, what are the big issues in this race?
Well, I mean, the big issues right now, it seems, is whether this is going to sort of be a national race in which Republicans would like to link Conor Lamb to Nancy Pelosi and the national Democratic leadership. That has been the message of all of the advertising they've put up on TV and digital ads. On the one hand, and then on the Democratic side, Conor Lamb would really like to make this a race about people's disgust with congressional leadership in both parties. He's really sort of portraying himself as a pox on both your houses kind of candidate, that he'll go to Washington, D.C. and work with Donald Trump or with Republicans or Democrats or whoever to deliver for the district. And so you've really got two very different kinds of messages happening in parallel and conflicting with each other on the airwaves and in newspaper stories like the ones I write.
Yeah, and there's billing on this race as being a referendum on the president. I'm curious if voters in the district see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say just yet, in part because Mr. Lamb himself is really not going hard at Donald Trump. That's the kind of stuff you and I are interested in as media figures. It's the kind of stuff that national pundits are interested in. But I think the Lamb campaign has made this kind of calculation that Donald Trump, who won the 18th district by about 20 points, is not a guy that you necessarily want to poke and antagonize because a lot of voters still feel very strongly for him. So what the Lamb campaign is really doing is going more at Paul Ryan and the congressional leadership, and when things like that very brief shutdown happened, decrying both parties and saying, we need a different leadership and we need a different mood in Washington. And I, a 33-year-old guy with no history in politics other than what my family name has brought me, I'm the guy to go there and sort of help usher that spirit in.
And how effective do you think that messaging is?
It's of course hard to say. I've seen or heard tell of some polling that suggests that this is a single-digit race. And I think that in that sense, it's been fairly successful. This is not a race that was expected to be competitive at all a few months ago. And what we've seen is, in fact, they're really making a game of it here on the Democratic side.
Yeah, how is that possible?
I think that it's worked well enough, at least so far.
I was just going to ask you, how is that possible? This hasn't been a competitive district in quite a while. What's the narrative that Democrats feel could potentially work and help them win this?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is early on, Republicans, almost from the outset, Rick Saccone has been a state legislator in the district, and yet there's a sense, among Republicans, and I hear this nationally and I hear it locally as well, that he has had a hard time kind of scaling up his campaign. There's a big difference between running for a state House seat, which is what Mr. Saccone currently holds, and a seat in the House of the U.S. Congress, and there seems to be a bit of a concern there in terms of his own fundraising, that he's just not getting it done. I think for Democrats, the challenge is, again, Conor Lamb is trying very hard to be kind of above the fray. At the same time, he receives support from national Democrats. Joe Biden was just in town a couple days ago, did not speak on Mr. Lamb's behalf, but I am told both by sources close to Mr. Biden and the Lamb campaign that he's going to be back probably in early March. The special election is on March 13th, so a few weeks before that. And I think that really suggests the kind of positioning that the Lamb campaign is trying to do. They certainly don't want Nancy Pelosi. I don't even know that they want Barack Obama per se, who didn't win the district in 2012. But Joe Biden is the kind of guy they want. He is a kind of blue-collar guy. He speaks very well to union interests, and the Lamb campaign is really very interested in turning out these union voters. Yeah.
This race, that we should remind the audience, is actually to fill a vacated seat by Republican Tim Murphy. He resigned after a report surfaced that he'd asked his mistress to have an abortion. What effect does that scandal have on this race? Excuse
me.
me.
So far we haven't heard much of Mr. Murphy's name. He has tried to keep a low profile. I've reported, as some others have, that Mr. Murphy was sitting on about a $1.2 million war chest when he resigned. That money has largely stayed on the sidelines. He certainly hasn't contributed to Mr. Saccone, and Mr. Saccone has said publicly that he does not want that money. To the extent that Mr. Murphy has contributed money, it was to a guy, Guy Reschenthaler, who was a candidate who had sought to be the Republican nominee in this seat, but didn't win. And I think part of the concern on the Republican side was there was this perception that Mr. Murphy had gotten behind this other candidate, Guy Reschenthaler, who's a state senator. And that really, that sort of rumor, that perception that there was a close relationship between those two men, I think really did have an effect on the party's decision to support Mr. Saccone back in November.
And we know eventually there's likely to be redistricting also in Pennsylvania. How do you think that's going to impact the 18th district?
Yeah, well, God only knows. If I knew the answer to that, I'd be making a lot more money than I would be as a staff writer at the Post-Gazette. In terms of the near future, it will have no effect whatsoever on this special election. When the state Supreme Court handed down this ruling insisting that the maps be redrawn, they very specifically said this will not affect the special election, which after all is only to fill the 18th seat through the end of this year. However, those maps will be in effect for the primary election, which will happen just 2 months after this special election we're having. And one of the concerns that Democrats have raised is the Republicans tried to draw a map in answer to the court's requirements, and that map drew Mr. Lamb out of the district. You can run from outside a district, but it also would have drawn Mr. Lamb's supporters, many of whom are from the South Hills suburbs of Pittsburgh. The whole Democratic game plan here is they're going to roll up the vote with college-educated suburban voters in Allegheny County, and that will offset some natural advantages Republicans have in some of the surrounding areas in the district. That map has been turned down. It now appears that the Supreme Court will draw its own map with the help of a special master. And what that map looks like, I don't think anybody can say with any confidence that they're right.
Chris Potter, well, all I can say is it's going to be fascinating months ahead for you covering politics in your state, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for your sympathy, yes.